Are the people at home still with us?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You kind of disappeared, and normally you don't. So let me see what I can do there. But I see that you're there. You're just going to have to shout out if you need anything. I can see you now. Okay. There we go. Now we can see people at home still. Before I start the discussion, how's everybody feeling? Doing okay with classes? And it's the end of the third week. I think we've kind of gotten a groove. I think we're doing okay. Anybody have any questions, just chime in. I am going to open up the rest of the Moodle page later today and tomorrow. I know I've just had the first few weeks open. I also am going to be sending you some emails via the Moodle page, so be sure and look for emails in the last couple of days about some things coming up. One thing that's coming up is you have your first kind of written assignment that's due in 10 days. It is a newspaper article. The instructions are on Moodle. I may send you some more instructions just to reinforce them. That is due on September 20th. So just want to put that on your radar. We also will be having a test relatively soon over the first few chapters. I think I had scheduled it for next week, but we're a little behind, so it'll probably be the following. And it'll be over just kind of what we've covered so far. Forgive me if I misspeak. I think the tests are like 75 points apiece. But I like to break them up so that you're not taking gigantic tests at once. So in 2 weeks, your first test will happen, and you have your first kind of written assignment. This week, in terms of your forum, Forum 5 is open this week, and it's about your local newspaper. So go ahead and work on Forum 5 and get that done this week. Have that done by, let's say, Monday, okay? Try to get that done. That gives you, or Tuesday we meet. Try to have it done before we meet Tuesday, okay? And so today we're going to start chapter 3. I don't think we'll finish it. So we will finish chapter 3 on Tuesday and start chapter 4 on Thursday. So if you do have extra time and want to read ahead, we'll get to chapter 4 next week, and we'll get you ready for the exam. So without kind of further ado, the first chapter we talked about was sort of an introduction to the mass media. Chapter 2 had to do with media technology. And the chapter for today, chapter 3, has to do with media economics. And I have to admit, my eyes kind of glaze over when I talk economics, and I had to go back and make myself reread the chapter a couple times because economics make my eyes glaze over, and I'm teaching a class. But it's so important because economics drives everything. It literally is what moves the media. And so it's really important that you have kind of a cursory understanding of media economics. So in this chapter, the book outlines several objectives. I kind of wish they would just give you like 3, but they do give you several. These are things that you should be able to do after reading this chapter. So one thing to really keep in mind that's different in the American media system from other media systems across the globe is that we are driven by capitalism. And so capitalism defines what the American mass media does. That can be good, that can be bad, but it's just what it is. And so it is the driving force. We're going to talk about some of the major sources of income for the mass media and way that they get their media, primarily advertising, direct sales, and we'll talk more about that. Mass media also is become more of a capitalist venture. We're going to talk a little bit about how people invest in the media. There was a time when capitalists did not invest in the media the way they do today, but it's perceived as kind of a hot commodity today. You had people who, in the beginning of the country, who set up their own presses. But I'm talking about people who's like, I'm going to invest in Facebook. I'm going to invest in this. And that's kind of a relatively new trend. We're also going to talk about media consolidation. One of the things that capitalism has done is capitalism sort of, the people who are strongest survive, but the people who aren't fail. And so there's a consolidation often of different medias. We'll also talk a little bit about how the media is managed and talk a little bit about divestiture since 2007. Who can tell me what happened in 2007 that caused divestiture? We're going to get to it a little bit on another slide, but what was a big thing that happened in December of 2007? It's really hard because there's only 5 of you in the room and I'm staring at you. Well, in 2008, we had a big economic recession, right? The bubble burst in the housing market and different things. And that really affected a lot of businesses. And people got scared to death and they divested of their investments. And it impacted a lot of different industries, including the media. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between invention and innovation. They sound a little bit like the same thing, but they're not exactly. And invention can lead to an innovation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. There's also media entrepreneurship is a relatively interesting trend. That's another thing we're going to talk about, along with the role of trade associations. Anybody in the room, can you tell me, or anybody listening at home, what's a trade association? Anybody know? Well, a trade association is an organization that represents a particular industry. There are a lot of them in Washington, D.C. I worked for one back in the 90s. It was a trade association or a national organization that represented nursing homes and long-term care facilities. It was called something like, I can't quite remember, American Association for Homes and Services of the Aging. And the whole purpose was that they would provide services and resources and lobbying for that particular industry. I didn't work there very long because I didn't find it very interesting to talk about aging issues. I was in my 30s and I might enjoy that more today, but you know, I just didn't do that very long. I'm not going to read this whole list to you. We're also going to talk a little bit about family-owned newspapers or media companies. My great-grandfather owned a newspaper. It's now defunct. It was a family-owned newspaper, and the whole family worked on it. It was a small-town paper called the Perry Mirror in Perry, Kansas, and but it went defunct like a lot of other newspapers. We're going to talk a lot about the changing role of advertising and alternative funding mechanisms for the media. So those are some of the things you ought to take out of the chapter. If you haven't read the chapter yet, I can't tell if you're not answering questions because you're just tired, and that's okay, or because you haven't read. So be sure and read chapter 3. Chapter 3 starts by talking about the changes in print journalism. And it's said from about, I think, 2003 and 2012, but don't hold me to those dates. They're on the first page of the chapter. But in that basic time period, that print journalism took a gigantic hit, and primarily in the newspaper industry. There were a lot of people who weren't taking a local newspaper anymore because there were other sources of income. And so print newspapers went through what the book called a bloodbath. And something like 17,000 jobs were lost in the newspaper industry alone. Now, for those of you who might be in the room or anybody majoring in multimedia journalism, okay? Anybody home majoring in multimedia journalism? The good news is, while that really happened and there was a bloodbath and traditional newspapers lost all these jobs in a relatively short period of time, multimedia journalism is on the rise. And so what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, in order for you to ride across platforms, there's jobs. Matter of fact, if you open up the One Ads or you Google and you put multimedia journalism, all kinds of jobs come up. So one thing I want you to hear me is that your profession is not dying, it's just changing. And it changed in a very substantial way that made a lot of people think it was gonna die. But what a lot of people have done is they've made digital journalism a thing. And so journalism will survive. But print, basically newspapers and a little bit magazines, were hurt by trends in the early 2000s. And what caused those trends? 17,000 people lost their job in about a 10-year period, maybe a little more. What happened right before that? The internet is part of it. So one of the things that really hurt newspapers is when you study the history of newspapers, one of the things that made them profitable was advertising. They could not exist without it. And particularly in newspapers, it was classified advertising. Now you still see a little in the Southeast Missouri and other papers, but not like you did. And classified advertising really helped fund a lot of newspapers. But with the internet, a lot of that went away. You don't need to pay for a classified ad, just put something out on social media. And now, I haven't used it yet, but there's something called Something Marketplace where you can put out what you want to sell, you can put out things and people buy from you directly. And so you don't need classified advertising. Well, that lack of revenue almost killed newspapers. And so the internet and that impact on advertising really hurt the print media. Does anybody know who Scott Bowles is? Anybody at home? Okay. You know, it's some days you just want to kind of sit there and take stuff in, so I'm going to let you. Okay. But you do need to make sure you're reading the book. Okay. Scott Bowles was a second-generation journalist who was mentioned in the introduction to Chapter 3 as an example of kind of what happened to print journalism. His father was a traditional journalist who worked for the Detroit Free Press. His father's name was Billy. So Billy Bowles was this hard-nosed, traditional newspaper man. And as a result, Scott got his love of journalism from his dad, and he went into journalism, and he worked at several newspapers. And his last newspaper job, at least mentioned in the book, he worked for USA Today. And then one day, shortly after his dad had died, he attended his dad's funeral, he gets laid off with a bunch of people from USA Today. Just laid off, he's gone. And the day he was laid off, his mom called up and canceled her subscription to USA Today. And they said, "Why are you canceling today?" And they said, you fired my son. I pictured my mom doing that if it was me. Well, he's kind of a representative figure of all the people who lost their jobs. But the print media, probably more than any other medium, was impacted negatively by the advance of the internet. So what are the financial foundations of our media system in America? Well, it's capitalism. And I'm going to ask you something you don't have to have read the book about. So what are some of the characteristics of capitalism? What are some traits? What's it mean to be a capitalist? People from home can chime in too if they want.
Very free market, sort of allows people, you know, if you have a good idea or something for a company to make that company and run with it as long as you can. Now, of course, still do have those big major companies that are always going to kind of rule over that sphere, you know, and that's due to not just capitalism, due to other things. So, I mean.
Yeah. So that's very good, and thank you for chiming in. For those of you at home who may not have heard him, he said one of the overarching characteristics is the free market. So in America, we kind of believe if you have a good idea and you put it out there, it will win the day. So the market will determine whether or not your newspaper stays or your TV station stays. Now, sometimes there's the bigger guys, the conglomerates, that might freeze you out, but basically the market will determine whether or not you're a success. And so capitalism has a huge, huge pressure for profits. One of the things that I kind of find fascinating about this is that that hasn't always been true. That yes, newspapers and other medium exist to make money, but it's not always been the case. I'll give you an example. When television news first began in the 1950s, there was a guy named Edward R. Murrow who had a great deal to do with covering the war over the radio. And he brought us the war, like the London Blitz, they were bombing, and he put his microphone down to the bottom and said, you know, here are the bombs, and people heard it. And he brought the war home. After the war, they decided what he did for radio, he should do for television. And Edward R. Murrow began, really, he was the person most responsible for television journalism. And it didn't matter if they made much money, because CBS, which was the premier news organization in the 50s, they were providing a public service. They had other programming, Gunsmoke and other things like that, that made money and had sponsors. And the news programs had some sponsors, but they didn't care if they made a profit. In fact, they often operated at a loss. And there's a really fascinating book for anybody out there who's interested in TV film called Who Killed CBS News? It's really too complicated. It would take a whole lecture to talk about that. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that profit is what made CBS kind of topple from the #1 news spot of all the networks. At the time, there were just 3, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And what happened was CBS did not care if their news programs made money until one did. 60 Minutes went on the air, and not only was it a great show for news, but it turned a profit. Holy crud. And once it turned a profit, all the other programs were expected to. Well, that really, once profit came into TV news, things really, really changed. I would also say that not that people didn't want to make money, but if you go all the way back to colonial America and early newspapers, a lot of them were putting out ideas, and they were trying to get ideas out into the marketplace, and they made a little money, but they weren't necessarily great businessmen. Ben Franklin was one of the most successful early newspaper men because he not only wanted to put ideas out, but he wanted to make money. And so he was very good at it. And he made so much money as a colonial printer that he was able to retire in his 40s and go on to be one of the founding fathers. And so pressure for profit today has impacted and changed news, some for the good, because your news, you know, you make enough money, you're going to stick around, but it also might color the way you do things. What do you think today's news programs sometimes do that you don't like that might be for profit? Okay, maybe this is a little unethical, this is a little shady, but I'm going to make money. Can you think of anything that news has done? And keep in mind, I'm pro-news, by the way. That doesn't mean we always do everything right. I think sometimes some of the programming is sensational in nature because it may or may not be the most ethical journalism, but if it's sensational, people will turn in and people, yeah, and you'll make money. And so I think money has affected the business. So what are the two major revenue streams for the media? Advertising and consumer sales. So advertising is not a medium. So advertising is not TV, it's not film, it's not newspapers, magazines, but it is an industry that supports those. So it's important to understand that advertising is not a medium, but without it, the mediums wouldn't exist. Consumer sales is when you sometimes are asked to buy things directly from the media that supports them. And so that's when you'll get a direct appeal for something. One of the things that I find kind of a pain in the neck is Netflix doesn't do this, but Amazon Prime does this. You already pay whatever a month to be a member of Amazon. And then you have to pay sometimes for extra movies. Or sometimes if you click on a movie that you think is free, it's actually from their Showtime channel. But in order to watch it, you have to subscribe to Showtime. And so they're constantly hawking other things. You know, there's a movie you want to see, but they're trying to get you to sell or buy something in order to see it. So this graph is in the textbook, and it's showing TV revenue shares by platform from 2010 to 2019. And so you can see here that the green is terrestrial, the blue is multi-channel, and the red is online. The book said, though, that online is going to start the next 5 years really taking over and becoming much more prominent. So over the next 5 years, we're going to see a move towards online. Do any of you guys watch traditional TV, like sit down, watch something at the time it airs? Okay. And do you do it often, or is it just a couple of favorite shows? Yeah. I've taken to where I always DVR my favorites in case something comes up and I'm not there. But I'm much older, and so I watch a lot of traditional TV. But I'm like that we have options, you know, if you can't watch something. Or sometimes if I'm committed to one TV show and it's against another TV show, I'll wait till both of them are, you know, completely done, and then I'll go back and on Netflix or something, I'll binge watch the show I didn't watch for several seasons. So I like that we have a lot of options. Okay, media properties have become big time investments in American society. So one of the things that you can do if you're rich enough is you can buy ownership shares in some companies. You see this sometimes in like a family-owned newspaper chain or media conglomerate or something where you can buy a share of it, just like you buy stock in Coke. You can buy a stock in Disney or whatever publicly traded company it might be, Facebook or something like that. Amazon and Netflix are things people are investing in. And Amazon's really kind of taken over the world, hasn't it? It's not just, you can watch Amazon Prime, which has a lot of movies and things like that, but you can get anything from Amazon. What I like about Amazon now is, you know, depending on what you need, whether or not it's a kitchen utensil or it's, you name an item, any random item, and you can get it on Amazon. And it's just as fast as practically going to the store or anything else. Well, Amazon and Netflix are making a big difference. A lot of people are cutting off traditional cable because it's gotten so expensive and watching Netflix. Venture capital, how many of you guys watch Shark Tank? Anybody? I love Shark Tank. I don't know why. I think secretly at heart I'd like to be a business person. But Shark Tank is where people who have a lot of money invest in entrepreneurs who bring them ideas. Venture capital is often invested in media companies and media projects and that kind of thing. The dot-com bust is exactly what it sounds like. In the 1980s, when the internet was very, very popular, there were a lot of companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, that were dot-com companies. And either there were too many of them, there was a glut in the market, or their ideas weren't really that good. A lot of them went bust. And so the dot-com bust refers to a period where a lot of dot-com companies went out of business. Any questions about anything we've covered so far? Okay. Back many years ago when I was taking a course, I think it was a course I was taking, I think at Purdue University, so it would have been around 2000. There was this book called Media Monopolies, and it was by a guy named, I think, Ben Badnikian. And he was talking about how more and more and more conglomerates were happening so that there were fewer and fewer voices in the marketplace of ideas. So and I'm making these numbers up because I don't know the exact numbers, but many, many years ago, let's say we had, thousands of media outlets, and then over conglomeration and different things, we come down to 100. You can see how there's a lot more squelching of voices because you have fewer people. Gannett Corporation is an interesting story about conglomerations, and I would like you to go read that when you're reading chapter. Make sure you pay attention to it. Gannett's interesting because Mr. Gannett really kind of started simply. He got some money together and bought a share of a newspaper, and it was a very successful newspaper. Then after a little more time, they bought into another newspaper and another newspaper, and now Gannett is a gigantic conglomeration of many, many newspapers in America, including USA Today. That's a Gannett property. And he has newspapers, actually, I don't know if Mr. Original Gannett is still around, but the Gannett Corporation still has many newspapers in other countries. So Gannett went from one newspaper to multi-newspapers across the globe. And so that's a very interesting conglomeration. And you can imagine, I think the Rolla Daily News, my hometown newspaper, and I haven't been there in years, I think they're now a Gannett paper, or they're at least owned by a chain. So they were, some daily newspapers are bought by chains or owned by chains, which means less originality of thought because they're doing what other chains within their organization do. So I'm not saying chains are bad, but it does make for more kind of cookie cutter news. This is a table from your textbook of the largest conglomerates, and they have market capital in billions. So Disney, not really surprising, Disney's worth 177.30 market capital in billions with a B. Disney owns, of course, the movie empire we're familiar with, and it owns many other media tentacles. Comcast is the next one, the 20th Century Fox, Time Warner Cable, Time Warner Inc., DirecTV, CBS, and Viacom. So you can see that these are pretty major corporations and how it'd be pretty hard to take them on. You'd have to have a pretty big empire to do so. So what are some of the characteristics of a conglomerate? Okay, don't worry about not having read it in the book, but how would a conglomerate be different than, you know, the Perry Mirror owned by a family in Kansas? What are some things about it that might impact the news? What are some traits or characteristics?
Conglomerates aren't going to, well, if you're running a small company, you're not going to go out and try to get more companies, try to buy more companies. You're going to try to, you know, build up your own company. While conglomerates will actively go out and try to buy out other companies. And well, I like Disney, they bought out most of 21st Century Fox. So, yeah, that's a big conglomerate. So, but that's sort of more, you know, it's swallowing up, you know, a lot of the smaller companies and larger companies at the same time. So.
Exactly right. And so smaller companies, maybe, not necessarily, but they may be able to focus more on the quality of the company that they're trying to build. They're about what their company can do that's unique. Conglomerates are about getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that doesn't mean that they don't care. I've never done an analysis of whether the Disney movies were better before Disney became bigger. I suspect being a conglomerate means you can still do pretty quality stuff. But it's just different. It's a different mindset. Divestiture means that it's the opposite of investment. I'm interested in Facebook. I think it's going somewhere, so I'm going to invest and buy stock. Something happens, I'm worried about that investment, so I sell my stock. That's called disinvestiture. And so disinvestiture is something that can hurt the media industry if it becomes a trend and a bunch of people do it. The Great Recession, which refers to not the stock market crash, but that refers to 2007 when we had the bubble and everyone lost their homes and stuff like that. And when that happened, a lot of people did sell their stocks, and it impacted a lot of different companies. One of the companies it talks about in the textbook is Knight Ridder, which was the second largest newspaper chain. And when this kind of recession hit, this Great Recession, it was really greatly damaged, and its board of directors had to sell off a part of it to another chain who then sold off a part of it. And so disinvestiture can sometimes damage even really giants. Knight Ridder, the second largest newspaper chain, it's not gone, but it was damaged by this Great Recession. Any questions about any of this stuff? Okay. Doing good, we got time. So the book talks quite a bit about invention and innovation and the relationship between them. And it's just kind of like, what? Well, an example taken back to something we've already seen is the invention of the movable type was when Johann Gutenberg took a wine press, put some metal type on it, got rid of grapes, put some paper down, pushed it, and he invented a printing press. It became more innovative when other people built off of that press, and eventually we got offset printing. Other things like, you know, you get a certain invention, and next thing you know, you're talking about iTunes and Spotify and all these different things that are innovations off of an invention. Human voice interactivity is an interesting one right now that's really, really popular. How many of you guys have an Alexa or a Siri or anything like that? Okay, I broke down and got Alexa mostly because I wanted to just be able to say, play this song or play this music without having to look it up. But it's really fascinating how important that is in society today. What do you guys like about it? What do you like about having one? Why do you have it? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious why you guys have it.
It gives easier access to, you know, if you're trying to define something.
Okay, it's like Google at voice command, kind of.
Yeah.
And like I said, I like it I primarily use mine for music, because a lot of the music I like is now old music, and so I'll say, play this person's music, you know, and so it's really a huge trend in the marketplace today. Matter of fact, there was a movie, I can't remember the name of it, about a guy who fell in love with his, yeah. And I don't know if it was a very good movie because I didn't go see it, but I thought what an interesting idea. So anyway, entrepreneurship. Most people who've gone into the media and the ownership level are entrepreneurs. They're people who invest in things and try to figure things out and that kind of thing. One of the examples that the book gave about entrepreneurial bent in the media was the invention of radio, and talked about the difference between the people who invent things and then the people who innovate things. They gave a really, really good example. We talked a little bit about Marconi. He was a guy who believed that you could take the wires from the telegraph and you could get rid of them and you could send sound waves wirelessly. And he was really interested in point-to-point communication. So it was Marconi who came up with wireless technology so that we could communicate without wires. And that's what he was interested in. He was interested in someone being able to call somebody else without having wires. Well, there was a guy named David Sarnoff who worked at the Marconi Company. And Sarnoff was a genius. Did you have a question? Or were you stretching?
Actually, I read a book about that, and there was actually some conflict between Marconi and, I can't remember his first name, the last one was Armstrong,
Yes.
about like who actually invented it first, and Armstrong actually had to go through many, like lawsuits about him, and eventually became the life.
Yes, Armstrong got in a lot of different lawsuits with different people because he also invented different things. He invented other things that helped bring us radio. He did make a contribution, and I think that Armstrong would be considered the one who did it. I'm sorry, Marconi. But Armstrong did other things too, like he came up with, I believe he was the one who came up with an audion tube, which made it better. But yeah, Armstrong was in the mix. And actually there are 4 or 5 or 6 different people. That's why really you can't say who invented radio, because the wireless technology was just one part of it. And so it's kind of a convoluted, it's not like the telephone. You can say, okay, Edison invented that. But thank you for bringing that up. But anyway, Marconi was interested in point-to-point communication, like, you know, radioing somebody, but without wires. David Sarnoff was this genius who worked for Marconi, and he saw the potential in the wireless technology, and he went to Marconi, and David Sarnoff said, look, we need to put he didn't really call it radio, but he said, we need to put this in everybody's home. He said, we can have a little device that just sits there, and we can play music, and we do this, we'd have programming. And he said, we could make a fortune. And Marconi was like, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the invention. Well, sure enough, Sarnoff starts his own company, goes on to become RCA, and he innovates Marconi's invention along with others, and he creates radio and puts it in everybody's home. Sarnoff has a similar epiphany about television. Sarnoff was one of the people who said, we need to take the technology for television and put it in everybody's home. So Sarnoff saw the innovation that could make him money. And one of the things that's interesting is a lot of inventors, you know, we watched a couple clips a week ago, they kind of died poor because they came up with the invention because they had the idea for the invention, but then often they didn't have the idea how to innovate it and how to make money. And other people came along later. So there are different media building empires. What's a media empire in culture and society today? A company that's an empire based in media. And we talked about Gannett, but what else? Disney. Facebook would be one, right? They decided to share or sell shares in Facebook. And for the first 5 years, Facebook didn't really care if it made a profit or not. You don't want to buy stock in a company that doesn't care, but they cared about what Facebook could do. So Facebook is kind of an empire. Amazon's definitely an empire since they went beyond just providing certain things, and they now provide services for almost anybody. Trade associations are organizations that exist to take care of industries. Things like, there are radio associations or TV associations. There's one called the Association for Newspaper Editors, ASNE, and it's an organization where they kind of get together and lobby about what it means to be a newspaper. Trade associations can have a lot of power depending upon the industry. And so they can make a big difference in terms of the economic patterns of some media empires. There are certain points that are kind of strategic for when media empires are more impactful than not. And one of the things that happens with trade associations is that they're trying to lobby and try to get support for their organizations. Right now, there's an interesting case. Have you guys heard of Stars and Stripes newspaper? Stars and Stripes newspaper was founded in the Civil War in Bloomfield, Missouri. And it was a newspaper designed to cover the war. And soldiers and people would read about the military in Stars and Stripes. And it is an American newspaper that covers the military. And Stars and Stripes has been around for years, and there's a museum dedicated to it in Bloomfield, Missouri. Stars and Stripes itself is published out of Washington, D.C. Well, right now, Congress is attempting to defund Stars and Stripes. Some members of Congress think it's just not worth putting the money into because it is a government funded newspaper. It has independence. So it covers the military independently, but it is funded by the government. So right now there's kind of a battle going on whether or not it's going to get defunded and whether or not it's going to continue. There are different groups as we speak who are lobbying on its behalf. But I've seen, like in the last couple of weeks, stories on CNN and opinion pieces and major national newspapers about Stars and Stripes, and people are trying to save Stars and Stripes. So some trade associations, I don't actually know if a particular trade association is working on its behalf, but there are people who are lobbying Congress on behalf of the newspaper. we've got a little time left, but this is kind of where I'd like to stop and pick up on Tuesday. And then finish the chapter. So I think, even though we've got a little time left, I think we'll go ahead and just knock off a little early today. And then we'll pick up here again on Tuesday. Look for my emails. There'll be some emails in the next couple of days about some things. Work on Form 5 on your hometown newspaper, and then make sure you catch up with your readings. And I'll be in touch. And look at the assignment that's due 10 days from today. It's on the Moodle page. Take a look at that. And if you'll wait, I'm going to turn off the recording. I'll come clean your seats. And I hope you guys have a good weekend.